So this is called briefing cases while practicing hypos, although maybe I should have put it the other way around. It's really practicing hypos while reading cases. So one of my bedrock principles is don't brief cases. If you've been with me at all for any length of time, you know that. The one thing I do recommend that you do is that you add very short case snippets to an outline very early on. I give instructions on that. It's maybe one or two, maybe 3 bullet points at most. And I give clear instructions on how to do that elsewhere. The deeper point I wanted to get to is that you need to read cases actively, whatever that means. Here's where I got this. Despite all my evidence from years of tutoring that you should not brief cases, one thing is stuck in my head over the years. I met someone some years ago back in New York at like a entrepreneurship for lawyers get together at the New York City bar. And I told my idea to this one woman who was launching an app. She was born from outside of the country. And she graduated summa, which is the highest level, possibly first in her class, but maybe it means she was just in the top 3 of her class, from Penn. And she told me she briefed cases. And nevertheless, she basically got straight A's. But she described a bit more what she was really doing, and it wasn't briefing cases in the sense that I've discussed before, the mindless exercise where you just basically treat a case like a frog that you're dissecting and you simply point out the pieces of anatomy of the case. That is not what she spent her time doing. So she said that she briefed cases and that she kind of wrote work product, but that's not what she did. Here's what she told me. She said basically that she read cases and made her own hypos as she read the cases. So what she really did was a form of active reading. Why would you do this? Research on pedagogy and on how the human brain works says that we really retain very little by reading. It's a passive form of learning. You sit and you're lectured at, or you sit and you read, and you can retain a lot. Obviously, most of you were pretty good at that, or else you wouldn't be in law school. You wouldn't have gotten to law school. So what is active reading in this context? It's not merely reading the case, but it's actively testing your understanding. You play with the case in your head, and there's a way to do that. The thing that you'll notice when you move from passive to really active learning is that it becomes much harder. It may already feel quite hard to read a case and just to understand it, but a lot of them are so boring. I did go through law school as well, and it didn't make reading the cases necessarily any more interesting. Sometimes there's a subject that you really love, or sometimes there's a funny case, but active learning should be difficult. And this is the format it should take, making your own hypotheticals. So I think it's basically got 3 steps. You read the case. Okay. Making your own hypos is after, let's assume that you've read the case and you understand what it's about. you create three new hypotheticals in your head. And this is kind of reverse engineering. First thing you do is you come up with a close variant of the case that you've just read, but just different enough that the outcome is different. Just whatever it takes to push it over the line into from liable to not liable for negligence, or for murder to it not being murder anymore, on the key issue at stake in the case. In a way, this is the easiest because you can work with the facts that you've been given from the case and try to adjust accordingly. Just all you have to do is tweak the case a little bit. And you'll notice this is sometimes what your professor spends time doing in class. This is another reason that you need to really pay close attention to what your professor's doing and saying, but that's the first step. Close facts, pretty similar facts, but just different enough to change the outcome. Then, new facts come up with a totally different scenario, but that leads to the same holding that still gets you to liability. So in other words, you're trying to come up with a situation that can use the case you just read as precedent to follow. You're coming up with a new situation where if you were a lawyer, you would be able to cite the case you're reading now as evidence that of how this new scenario should turn out. And then finally, you've got new facts, again, maybe a close variant of this completely new situation that you've come up with, and you change it just enough to get to a different outcome. Okay. So you can kind of look at it this way. You've got this is the case that you've read. And you want to create don't know why it's doing this freakish thing. Anyway, so we've got old case, different outcome. This is the first one. You create, as your second hypo, a totally new scenario with the same outcome. And the last thing you do is to create a variant of the new hypo that just pushes you over the line to get a different outcome. Let's make this a little more concrete. One of the hypos, one of the cases that I've done a video case brief for is Powellsgraph, New York Court of Appeals. And as a quick reminder, you've got Long Island Railroad, a clock, and an old woman. Guy with explosives gets on the Long Island Railroad. And it's a negligence case because you have these two idiots who work for the railroad who are pushing the guy with the explosives. Sorry, this is the guy with the explosives. One's pulling him onto the train, one's pushing the guy. The bag drops, and you have an explosion, it rocks the whole platform and it causes this clock to fall on her. Okay, so the case is a strange one in that it probably should have been about proximate cause, but Justice Cardozo made it about a duty that these workers here in this situation had no duty to the woman who was all the way down here on the platform. So, first typo that we come up with, close facts, different outcome. Let's say we've got the train and the explosives. I'm not going to draw the people. Forget the clock. We've got the old woman who's on the far end of the platform, and there's her heart. There's an explosion, and the loud noise gives her a heart attack. I'm not saying that a case like this would necessarily follow Paul's graph. What is instructive is trying to come up with a case that's a little bit closer. In other words, maybe you're talking directly to Justice Cardozo and you say, okay, maybe it's weird, it's too much of a Rube Goldberg machine. Package explodes, train platform rattles, clock falls on woman. Then, okay, what would be on the right side of the line where there actually is a duty to this old woman? It seems to me that this explosion is somewhat more direct in terms. Now, you might disagree, but the point of this exercise is not necessarily come up with a winner, but it's to see how much closer can you get to a scenario where you get a slightly different outcome, where in this case, Justice Cardozo and a majority of the New York Court of Appeals would say, you know what, Long Island Railroad in that case did have a duty not to let things explode because, and this is where the analysis I think is muddied in the case. Maybe it was a little more foreseeable that an explosion could cause this kind of problem. Okay. New facts and maybe the same outcome. You buy your friend a Tesla, and it's totally, and it's one of the self-driving ones. And you're zooming past someone, you're speeding, you're doing 85 in a 25-mile-an-hour zone. And you cause, worse. It's a 15-mile-per-hour zone, and it's a school zone, and there are these kids, and an adult, a quite older adult, has to get them out of the way of the speeding self-driving car that you've purchased for your friend. Okay? He succeeds in doing that, gets him out of the way, but he's got a pacemaker on his heart, and I'm not much of an engineer, but basically, I really hate whatever my pen is doing at the moment, but I do know that a giant electric motor is basically a giant magnet. It's a near miss. And it messes with the guy's pacemaker and he dies. Again, you could argue, maybe this is a kind of different, not similar enough to Paul's graph, but if you were arguing on behalf of this guy, if you were, say, sorry, the person who now owns the self-driving Tesla, you would say this is really too attenuated. And maybe you would even concede, um, maybe here these people are in the zone of danger because a self-driving car might run someone over, but we never expected um, that the magnet in the self-driving Tesla would like wipe out the guy's pacemaker, especially because he was just getting these children out of the way. Um, maybe you even argue that the car would have stopped. I don't know. So new facts, different outcome. You've got the best looking Tesla in the world. Um, and you have the same guy with the pacemaker, except instead of running away from a giant runaway car, he like sits in the car. Who knows? He sits on the hood because I don't know. I have to make something up. I did do this on the fly. And then the magnet causes him to have a heart attack. And maybe he's an old dude and doesn't know what Teslas do. Now, would he be liable? I don't know. But I feel like this is a somewhat less attenuated case than he dashes out in front of the car and somehow the near miss is close enough to disrupt his pacemaker. All this seems like pretty far away from the original facts of Paul's graph, but after having gone through this exercise and hopefully even watching this, although the point isn't merely to watch it, it's to do it yourself. Paul's graph and what you can do with Paul's graph is really stuck in your head much more effectively at this point. So let's review the benefits of taking this approach, this active approach to reading your cases. Active learning, truly active learning really will lock a case in your mind. Partly because really concretely, this is a weird way to look at it. You don't just have this kind of spot in your mind that's like Paul's graph. You then have these other branches. I don't know what brains look like. Okay, I didn't take biology in college. But you do have more pathways in your brain that have created context in a way for you to lock this case into your brain. You've also reverse engineered Paul's graph in the sense that you're kind of creating new scenarios that focus very much on the issue of foreseeability and how that's linked to duty to the person who's suing you. You get something approximating a closer, true understanding of the case. Even if you have a good memory and you can recite the facts of Paul's graph, understanding isn't just being able to recite it. In the context of a law school exam, the ultimate point is to be able to use the case in a useful way. And this exercise forces you to try to do that. Now, it's still not the same thing as getting a new set of facts and having to find what applies to those facts, where you might have no certainty that Paul's graph is something that you would end up applying, but it then becomes a tool, a more active tool, than if you just read the case. It's an indirect way to practice hypos, perhaps during an especially busy period when you're not actively taking hypos. And this is perhaps a way to anticipate exam questions if you're kind of inventing things or you know some kinds of facts that your professor's into. So in short, yeah. Okay, the shortest formula for success, nothing's reducible to this, but don't brief cases and take a practice exam a day. But sometimes you can't tap-yod. Sometimes it ends up being take a practice exam a week or every other day, but you do end up reading cases every day. So rather than just kind of dully reading your casebook or using it to hit yourself in the head because you're so bored, create practice hypos while you're reading cases. Here's a new acronym, MYO. MYO, make your own hypos. And the three elements of that are come up with a situation that's similar to the case that you're reading, but just different enough to produce a different outcome. Then create a new case, a new set of facts that's different from the one that you're reading, but that lands you at the same outcome. And then a new set of facts that's just a little bit different from this new situation, that's just different enough from this one to create a different hypo. And the reason you do this, finally to recap, is that case facts will stick in your head better and you'll have practice hypos. So, any questions on that? You can either jump in or ask a question in the chat.